Hello and welcome back to the Argyle HR Leadership Forum, Trends, Talent Analytics, and Change Management. My name is Michael with Argyle. A couple of notes before I turn things over to our panel moderator. First, a quick reminder to stop by our sponsors' virtual booths at any time during today's event and for the following week. Our partners are committed to providing you with valuable content and a great overall experience. At any time during today's event, you can visit their virtual booths from the main agenda page, which include complimentary materials, information, and meet and greet opportunities. Now, to ask questions throughout the session, simply type into the Q&A chat and we will address your questions at the end of the session. And now, without further delay, I'd like to introduce our moderator. Tony Carter, Chief Inclusion and Collaboration Officer, Inclusive Future and Strategy Director with Idaho National Laboratory. We're excited to have Tony and our panelists with us for a panel discussion titled Talent Analytics for a Fairer Workplace. Tony, we're so excited to have you with us today. Welcome, and over to you.
All right, thank you, Michael. I appreciate the special invitation to share with your platform today. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to everyone across the world. We want to welcome you today to this amazing conversation about how we can create fairer workplaces around the world. First of all, I'd like to start this discussion by inviting my esteemed panelists to introduce themselves and briefly describe how they've used talent analytics over the past year. So, Zach, let's start with you.
All right, thanks, Tony. Zach Frank from Nashville, Tennessee. I lead people analytics at Freeman, which is the largest event services company in the US. So I switched companies mid-year. First half of the year, I was really focused on global integration. So just things like how do we talk about diversity from US to UK to China. And then since I moved, I've been focused a lot more on fundamentals and foundational work. So building data sets, building data marts, and foundational dashboards. And Freeman is focused a lot on retention. So I've had a ton of retention conversations in the last few months.
Fantastic. Thank you, Zach. Kat, what about you?
Thanks, Tony. Thanks for the invitation for this panel. Really look forward for the discussion. Hi, everyone. My name is Ankit. I lead the people analytics function at MassMutual. Overall, I have about 15 years of experience in the space of analytics with roughly about 10 years in the space of people analytics. In my current role, actually, I've been leading people analytics for MassMutual for the past 3 years. And in this, I have the opportunity to build the function right from the scratch, wherein first my focus was around the centralization of the reporting and the data governance. Then we also kind of automated a lot of dashboards and created new things for our stakeholders. Plus, right now we are focusing mostly on the artificial intelligence and the data analytics piece right now for our company to provide them more proactive analysis so that they can take the decisions based on the data that we are providing to them. Look forward for the discussion.
Fantastic. Thank you. Christopher, bring us home.
Yes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone as well. So my name is Chris Ursoli, and I'm the Senior Associate Director of People Analytics at a global pharmaceutical company, Boehringer Ingelheim. I've been in this space, I guess, as long as it's been called People Analytics and then some. By background, I'm an industrial organizational psychologist, so I love understanding what makes people tick. And we have a lot of science and a lot of practice to do that. And I love bringing that and combining with data to tell better stories. And telling better stories that leads to more action that really maximizes the impact and the potential of our people resources. So the DEI area, which I'm excited to talk about today, is a place where there's just such a need and there's so much opportunity that I'm really looking forward to connecting with the other panelists and sharing what my experiences and observations have been in that time.
Fantastic, and thank you, team. As Michael mentioned, I'm Tony Carter, Chief Inclusion and Collaboration Officer for Idaho National Laboratory in the beautiful city of Idaho Falls, Idaho. We create next generation energy solutions and protect the nation's most critical infrastructure. So team, let's dive into our conversation for today. Zach, from your perspective, what are the elements of a successful diversity, equity, and inclusion talent analytics strategy?
Yeah, so I think the first thing that's important to recognize here is that your DEI specific strategy is part of a larger set of strategies. So in analytics, and this may be true in other businesses or other parts of the business, other functions, but this is where I spent basically all of my career. So in analytics, and specifically in people analytics, your strategy is really a series of strategies. So you've got where you're growing on the maturity curve in terms of what kind of analytics you're delivering. You've got your volume and sophistication of user adoption and considered questions. So how are you interacting with your business partners and HR leaders? You've got your underlying technical strategy. So how are we growing our technical architecture and data set governance and maturity to be able to deliver on these other problems? You've got your operational delivery aspects, and then you've got specific business outcomes. And that's not holistic. It's just talking about you've got all these different individual strategies that kind of build to this whole people analytics and analytics in general strategy. So then you get into your domain specific of which D&I. So I think that's the first thing, is just recognizing that your D&I specific strategy is a domain specific strategy cutting across all these other different functional strategies that you're going to have. So just kind of that framing is important. Well, then what do you do with it, and how do you make sure that it's good? So first thing is alignment. So I think of this as like spend 90 to 95% of your energy, time, focus on this, delivering where the business is ready to engage in D&I efforts, right? So what the business is talking about, what it's focusing on, where it's ready to act on D&I, deliver on that. Figure out how you do that in a good way. Figure out how you use good data, how you use good processes to be able to do that in a way that's meaningful. And then the rest of that time spend on expanding this concern. So right now, if your company only talks about diversity in the sense of race and gender, well, all right, what if we talk about people with disabilities? How are we leaving out that part of our workforce, and how do we expand that conversation? And then the other part is just focus, right? So this, a really simple example of this, diversity has all these different subsegments that we can look at in terms of how you look at the data and how you talk about it. And we're already talking about all these other domains that sit under people analytics: learning, talent acquisition, talent management, basic headcount, and workforce segmentation and things like that. So how do we focus on specific parts where we can move these levers to work within the business alignment, right? And how do we do that in a way that leads to the most overall leverage? So, all right, let's work on focusing, on gender and racial diversity within our executive band, because then we know we're going to have downstream impacts in that in terms of greater overall diversity inclusion within the organization. So just that alignment to where the business is, and then focusing on particular aspects of the business and really, really small portions of how can we get something that is easy to understand and look at and measure, and is also going to have a really big impact in terms of where the business wants to move.
Yeah, Zach, that's fantastic. And I think oftentimes, particularly inclusion practitioners, we're trying to move the business ahead of where the business is ready to go. And we know we are just never going to be successful unless the business is really ready to head in a certain direction. You also make a good point about alignment to the business plan as well as the business objective. We have to, I think Christopher said it in one of our conversations earlier, they expect finance to have zero balances, and HR should probably get as close to that as possible too. We need to be leading with good data. Something amazing you want to share right now. Tell us what's on your mind.
So from my perspective, I would say is that when you look at for the elements of the DEI strategy, what for me is the most important, whether it is DEI strategy or any strategy, you have to have a very clear objective, what you are trying to achieve from that. And in order to achieve your objective, first thing is the assessment piece of it, right? So you have to basically look at the data and just try to understand where you are and how you are going to achieve that, right? So those are the most important element for me, a couple of things. And I think a lot of organizations where they struggle is, first thing is that though they have the objectives, but when they look at the quality of the data, it is not up to the mark. And that's where they struggle big time to take the decision on top of it. So I think as a talent analytics practitioner, what I always recommend is that how you can always bridge that gap, how you can take the decision based on improving the quality of the data and also how you are kind of building your strategy on top of it, right? So that's the another piece. And then also you have to have a very common language when you speak across the stakeholders. You cannot have one person talking different things. So you have the KPIs set up very clearly and everyone is speaking the same language, which is an important piece of it. And in order to be successful with respect to any strategy is the communication piece of it, right? So you're building a relationship and having a very transparent conversation with your stakeholders to pass on what is happening, what the opportunities are, and how we are going to tackle in the long run so that we can address any kind of a gaps which exist currently. So those are key elements for me to achieve strategy success for us, whether it is DI or any other area that you look upon. From the talent analytics point of view, these are the support that we can definitely offer.
Yeah, I love it. And I'm glad that you brought up, as well as Zach, sometimes businesses don't have accurate data when they start, but that doesn't mean we shouldn't start. We have to start somewhere and creating that baseline and growing from it. So I love it. Great conversation, team. Anket, another question for you. What are some ways that HR leaders can use talent analytics to create a fairer workplace?
Excellent question, because I think this is where the talent analytics has a lot of role to play. And of course, if you look at the usage of the talent analytics, it has grown over the past few years quite a bit. And all the organizations are kind of focusing and investing into this function just to make sure that, you have a lot of information available to them so that they can make decisions based on the facts rather than the emotions. So that's where I think talent analytics has a big role to play. And in order to really achieve that, what I believe is that you have to really look upon the current state of the things. And when you look at the overall from the HR perspective, the life cycle of the employee, it is just not one part of that, but the entire life cycle you have to firstly assess and see what are the opportunities that are in front of us, right? So for example, like if you're looking from the diversity recruiting perspective, do you see that over a period of time, how we are kind of hiring the people, what kind of a distribution of different race, ethnicity, gender, or whatever way you want to approach that. But definitely whatever your priorities are, based on that, you can actually look upon different stages of the life cycle of an employee. Think about where the opportunities exist. And then to make sure that, these gaps, are there a reason associated with that and how we can basically bridge those gaps? For example, if you have, as I mentioned, that in certain managers or certain hotspots you find from the data, you dice the information and look upon, are we treating some individuals differently compared to the other? Are there managers who are behaving differently? That's where you can create an action plan to address the gaps. And basically that helps you kind of bridge those gaps and eventually help you succeed over a period of time. But again, once you build that plan and you start implementing it, it is also important to revisit whether it is kind of meeting your goals, or is it kind over a period of time, is it able to achieve what you kind of set out the vision at the start of the program or initiative, rather than just leave it hanging. We implemented something and we don't check it. So it is always important to go back in the past and see if the situation has improved over a period of time. So that's how I would go about how talent analytics can help the HR leaders to create a fairer workplace.
Fantastic. Team, who else has something else they want to add here?
Yeah, I would just echo and underscore a couple of points, that Ankit, just suggested here, and that Zach had suggested before. There's got to be a framework that you can use to think about and prioritize things, right? So part of the elements of having a fair workplace is that you want to address the places where there's the biggest differences, departures, whatever that may look like. You want to be able to address them first, and you can't do that unless you have a holistic view. So I think that's really, really critical. And along the way too, there's got to be that clarity and simplicity, right? So if you're going to have this fair workplace, fairness is such a fundamental concept that governs human behavior. It has to be easily understandable. Complex laws probably get broken more than very, very simple, straightforward laws.
Yeah, that's fantastic. You both bring up some good points. And one that I'm really passionate about is around the talent acquisition process. And I think more organizations really need to spend time looking at the qualified applicants that come into their processes, how many of those applicants are actually getting interviews, and then who is really getting an offer extended at the end of the day. I think sometimes employers miss this critical area of discovery, and you can learn a lot from it. And I think to the points that have been made here early today, we have to look at it from many different inclusion lenses, not only how are women and people of color faring in the processes, but what is happening to the veterans, what's happening to people with disabilities, where are our LGBT colleagues? So we really need to pay close attention to this. From my perspective, inclusion is a business priority. And if we aren't looking at inclusion as a priority, as a business imperative, then our businesses are probably not going to be as successful as they could be. Chris, this brings me to a question I've been thinking about directly for you. And it's, how can we demonstrate to our leaders how the enterprise as a whole can benefit from using analytics in this area?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I've worked with a number of different organizations in this space. So forgive me, my experiences here are not necessarily for one particular organization, but it really speaks to, you have to be able to embed the DEI analytics within the framework of the business, right? It's something you suggested there. How do we make this a need to have, not a nice to have? And not that I think anyone explicitly feels that way, but how can we make sure that that is embedded? And part of the place where we start, which maybe isn't fully intuitive at first, is we have to make sure we're good at measuring the things that we're bringing to them that maybe don't have intrinsically a lot to do with DEI. So reporting on turnover rates, promotion rates. You spoke, Tony, about the candidate journey, right? Do we even have good data on there before we try to tell a story through that DEI perspective, right? So it's tempting for us to say, look, give me the data. I can't tell you with the number of times I've heard the story, we just want the data. Well, data alone don't necessarily tell a story and can very easily be led to tell a misleading story. So where I go first is where you can really demonstrate that value to the business to DEI is make sure you get sort of just your fundamentals right. I'm not saying you have to be across the finish line, but you have to have some very basic fundamentals, right? Because if you go to the business and say that turnover for females has skyrocketed, that may be numerically true, but that may not be driving the conclusion it should. Because, say, for example, turnover for females went way up, but what if we were also hiring them at a higher rate, right? So you need to have that framework to Zach's and Ankit's standpoint. You have to have that talent life cycle perspective. So really, if you want the business to see the value, get them that, and then you're no longer reporting DEI analytics per se, you're reporting those key moments that matter, those really high level things through a DEI lens. And then you've turned everything you do into a conceptualization of fairness, which is something everyone can get behind, whether you're directly impacted or less directly impacted by those. And once you have that framework and you're including the things that are already in the business leaders' accountabilities, you can then attach dollars to those, right? So turnover, for example, we can speak about the cost of turnover, preventing turnover. Well, if we have that, we have it set right, well, then we could talk about the cost of turnover for people of color relative to their white counterparts. And if there's a difference, we can calculate the difference. And we can very simply show up with a very clear calculation, again, to Ankit's point about being just very clear and straightforward. We can provide the business, like, look, we should be understanding the reasons why, say, people of color are leaving at higher rates. And here's the dollar value that's costing the organization. So it puts it in a language that they're just used to talking on an ongoing basis, and it thrusts an accountability on them. And so I think, Tony, you had also said at the beginning of the conversation, we may sometimes be asking the business to move a little bit faster than they are, but if we can get in their lane that they're swimming in and talk the language that they're talking in, we can get them to move a little bit further, and they are willing and striving to make that change.
Yeah, I totally agree with you, Chris. And I just want to point out, we don't have to have all of our eggs in one basket to move forward, because sometimes businesses want to make sure we have everything exactly the way it should be before we can move an initiative forward. And for people like me, that could be, or that could mean for us that our careers will be stagnated for 100 years at the entry level because we're worried about, do we have every single thing right? I believe in this inclusion space, everything is a journey. Data analytics is a journey, culture is a journey, and we have to just keep working on these things and make them better over time. But I'm encouraging all the businesses out there that even if you aren't where you exactly want to be on this talent journey, and for some of you, you may be just starting out on this journey. I've seen some of the questions come in from chat. Just start where you're at and evolve them over time, but don't just sit back and wait until you have everything perfect, because if you do, that means some people will get left behind, and none of us want to see that. On Kat, Zach, anything you want to add before we turn our heads in a different direction?
So one thing, Tony, from my perspective, I think what Chris said is kind of resonated quite a bit with me. One thing which I will just add is that as a talent analytics group, when my organization or in my past experience, what I've noticed is that we have the opportunity just not to look upon the internal data, but also kind of integrate this with the external data. And I give you an example, like during the pandemic, there were a lot of reports and a lot of things that we read across as an analytics when we were doing. We found out that there is a different degree of attrition that you see across different set of people. And especially if you go within termination rate, there was a retirement. And what we read is that based on the gender, based on the race, the retirement rates have kind of peaked up in some areas. And that is something which works as an input for us when we are also working with the internal data. And that's where we always inform our leadership and keep them privy about what is happening, not just with the internal data, but also the external data, so that they are much more informed before they take any kind of a decision. And same goes with respect to, drafting any policies or anything that they had to do. We are continuously monitoring pulse surveys. We are continuously looking at the engagement survey internally. Plus also we are collecting a lot of trends, what are happening across the industry, right? Like Great Resignation was a prime example where we collected a lot of information from there. What is the impact it is going to give on our population and different kind of a population, how they are going to behave over a period of time. So that's where the talent analytics significant value, what we had seen during the pandemic. And also, of course, right now with so much change coming in across with the flexible workplace and so many things going on. And that's where we are kind of helping the organization quite a bit, whether it is the DI strategy or in general, the overall people analytics strategy as well.
Just a quick note there, and then jump to you, Zach.
Yeah.
I mean, it's context, right? I mean, we bring value to the organization by delivering context. So as our bigger, we want to understand our turnover relative to maybe an external, our external peers. What is our turnover for, let's say, females relative to turnover for females, external peers? Now, we don't know why, but it's one piece we can get context. In that holistic view can tell us, well, is turnover our biggest male-female difference, or is promotion our biggest male-female difference? So like Tony, you've got a fantastic point. Like, we can't wait till all this is buttoned down and wrapped up to move forward, but we have to think about how do we get that context so we make sure we give them a holistic perspective about where to move. And sorry, Zach, I just wanted to jump in there real quick. Please go ahead.
Yeah, no, I mean, it's a great point. And I think, taking all those ideas together, kind of that one thing that will always benefit, specifically for people analytics practitioners, one thing that will benefit you is get good about talking to your senior stakeholders about scientific research. So other research that you did not do, stuff that's out there in the marketplace, right? So really specific example of this, we were trying to, this research out there about women and people of color tend to underreport their capabilities on their resumes, right? And so my team put together all this data about, all right, here's how much we think we can speed up time to hire and fill roles if we, kind of look at requirements differently and pass this information along. And so we get into the meeting and we're communicating this to the HR leadership team, and like, all right, women and people of color tend to underreport themselves on their resumes. And I think we can significantly speed up time to hire and fill these roles if we do these 3 things in terms of how we're looking at requirements and how we communicate that to managers, right? And I was ready to then bring in the rest of the data and tell them how much and do all these other things. They're like, all right, cool. We'll go and talk to the business leaders about this. We'll make it happen. And that was it. And so it didn't have to be perfect, but that ability to communicate what was already out there in the marketplace well and get them to understand, hey, here's all this really great research. We can just move in this direction. And they were ready for it. And we saw really good impacts from it.
Fantastic. So team, really what we're saying here today is about people as well as processes. It's not one or the other. We need them both. OnCat, you started to talk about examples of how leaders can use talent analytics to drive improvements in fairness and diversity and equity and inclusion within their organization. And I want you to just drill down on that concept a little bit more. But I want to interject here too. I also think we have to take the time to share relevant information with our business leaders, because most of our business leaders are, they are consuming a lot of content from a lot of different places because that is important to them, particularly around people. I don't know any executive who is not interested in not only attracting but retaining their folks. I say all that to say this: even with all the great resignation information that's been shared for the last couple of years, of course, our business leaders were going to be concerned about that. They wanted to know, are we seeing the same things that the rest of the country and actually in some parts of the world are seeing? And when we dug into our data, that is not what was happening at INL. And so our team made the recommendation that actually our attrition rate is quite low. It's below what you would normally expect. And it's pretty much stayed that way throughout the entire COVID-19 pandemic. But what we said was, we do realize we also need to continue to be flexible, which I think Zach has said 2 times today already, and to show our people empathy within this process. And, Idaho National Laboratory is a research organization. And when you talk about analytics, guess what we saw? Not only did our people stay engaged and connected, but our publications went up. And guess what? In the first author publication round, we saw more publications from women and people of color during that time slot. Now, I want to caveat that to sometimes we know publications are cyclical, right? Because a lot of times when we're writing stuff, we've been working on them for a year or two. So we'll continue to monitor this for the next few years to see exactly what the total impact might have been. But I said all that to say this, team, let's try to help our organizations sift through some of this stuff that they're seeing and make good business decisions. I mean, we've been hearing a lot of talk in the last, 6 months about quietly quitting. Now, what's different from quietly quitting than employee disengagement? I mean, it's like we latch on to these trends and then we start throwing them out there like they're new ideas when we're actually talking about the same old stuff. So I wanted to throw that out there, but OnCat, go on and continue to drive us down this path, because you were talking about getting information from employee engagement surveys, focus groups, talking to the business. Go ahead and tell us what can we do here to drive improvements in fairness within our organizations around this?
First, Tony, I think you brought up a very good point where you said that, it is important to share the information with the leaders. And I think that's where I always focus on the democratization of the data, right? So it is just not limiting to the senior leaders, but also how you can make it available to the different level of the managers so that they can actually effectively run their organization. I think in my past experience in many other organizations, what I have noticed is that generally the HR organizations are not very comfortable in sharing the information outside the HR too much. They generally keep it only to the senior leaders. But I think over a period of time, what different organizations are also realizing that it is now, if you want to hold managers accountable for certain decisions, you have to make that data available, right? Mm-hmm. I think a lot of places you have heard about different kind of analysis or the examples that have been shared with the senior leaders. But if you're not making it available to the managers who are taking actions, then it does not lead to the intended outcome that you desire, right? So that's something which I just want to hit upon before I go into some of the examples, what I have seen based on my experience. And of course, if you look at from the DEI perspective, I think one of the biggest thing what I have noticed across organization, and I think based on my past experience, what I noticed is that there are organizations, they want to do a lot of work in terms of bringing the diverse talent. But when it comes down to the strategy of what exactly they are going to do, that's where they lack a little bit. And of course, one of the primary reasons is that not having a clear information around the data. And I think, Tony, probably you might have mentioned it earlier. It is one of the things which I and my team have noticed in the past is that if you look at the different races or ethnicities and the gender, the drop off through the funnel of the hiring is very different, not always the same across the board. And that's where it is important for the organization to really understand which areas are we seeing that drop off significantly different for particular races or gender, or LGBTQ veteran or disabled population, that is disability population. That's where you have to, this kind of a people analytics data or talent analytics data can help you really nail down the opportunities where you need to really take an action. So this is kind of one of the examples. Plus also, I mean, this can actually lead to some sort of a decision. So I give you an example, like based on my experience, what I've seen, one of my past organization did that is that they created a mandate that when you are hiring for any position, you have to have at least one people of color in the interview slate. Before that, you cannot really move on to the hire. So you have to have that diversity. And that's how they were able to achieve what they wanted over a period of time. So this is a kind of an example which I wanted to give. The other example I'll give you is that it's a very basic example. It's around the time off actually, because I think what I noticed also during the early stages of the pandemic, that the time off is not being utilized equally by the people of different colors, right? So different races and ethnicities, gender, they are not using different, because the pandemic impacted people almost the same way, but the behavior of the people was very different during the pandemic, and a lot of people were overworked and they were not able to take time. And we actually found that it varies across different places, and that's where the encouragement and that's where the importance of sharing the data with the manager was there, so that the managers are aware that these are the opportunities. Okay, why my people are not taking the time off, and now I have to encourage them rather than them overworked, and that eventually leading to the impact of them leaving the organization, which is a kind of build up for the great resignation also, right? So that's how we kind of correlated a lot of information, tried to come out with a more hypothesis testing, which helped us kind of stay ahead in the game to make sure that the people we are retaining, and we are making the flexibility piece, which Chris brought up, right? So where we are offering the flexibility to the employees so that they can stay here, take time off, they can enjoy their time rather than being overworked and eventually leave the organization. So these are some of the examples which I just wanted to share with all of you.
Yeah, thank you. Those are great examples. And it amazes me how sometimes organizations want to hold people leaders accountable without providing them data. I don't know how you do that, but we've got to share the data if we want people to actually take action on what's going on. Let us jump right into something else that's very important to this discussion: bias. We know bias is in everything. Chris, how can we mitigate or remove biases within the analytics technologies? We know that they're there.
Yeah, this is an interesting question, because this makes me think of a few things. In very specific contexts, we actually intentionally differentiate among people. We want to differentiate among our top performers, middle performers, bottom performers. We want to differentiate our applicants from those who are qualified, who are unqualified. What we don't want to do is differentiate purely on the base, or accidentally, on the basis of membership in a protected class. So race, gender, ethnicity, sexual orientation, and more. And so one of the things we tend to go to is to think, well, there must be something intentionally that somebody somewhere is doing. We want to look for root causes, we naturally do. And where I go to first is, again, let's focus on processes over people. Let's assume positive intent. So this is my psychology background. Let's assume positive intent for people, and then really carefully scrutinize our processes. And that way we'll be able to change things, right? So if we think about that, one of the first things we don't want to do is forget the human element. Human behavior is complex, right? So we have to understand there are places where we, business leaders tend to look first when they think there's an underrepresentation challenge, right? And, Ankit, your example doesn't surprise me at all. It's like our first place we go to is to TA, and the first thing we do is, what is it? Is it the Rooney Rule? Every rec's got to have one of these, one of these, one of these. And that's well-intentioned in a lot of cases, and it can lead to some very quick changes. But then other things may tend to pop up, right? So is one of these enough? Is one of these too many based on what's in the population, right? So Ankit, again, like you're talking about getting the population, if we're talking about nurses, if we have a female representation of 90%, that's fantastic. If we're talking about engineers, that's terrible if we're talking about nurses. So we want to really think carefully about understanding what it is we're really solving for, not forgetting that human element, right? We intentionally have human elements in our processes. So recruiters, we have them. How do we think through we assume positive intent, but understand the process they're looking at. Do they have the right checklist? Those sorts of things. Are they operating under the proper intents? Understanding cognition biases, not interpersonal, but cognition biases like recency things, those sorts of things. Another way that's a little bit less focused on that is helping our businesses to move away from one imperfect indicator. We want to focus on one thing, right? So we focus on maybe one single item in a survey. Well, if we see a male-female difference, then we still don't want to conclude that there really is a big difference in experience. We want to look at multiple survey items. We want to look at maybe multi-step recruiting processes, right? We want to have different things that we're doing. We don't want one single indicator. We also have to understand complexity, right? So when we think about reducing biases, we tend to focus biases and think about biases in particular directions. So we might think, let's look at the race or ethnicity, or blind the race or ethnicity of our applicants. Well, our recruiters, our incumbents also bring some of those demographic factors to the table, right? So how can you understand the interplay between maybe recruiter race and ethnicity and applicant race and ethnicity? And there can be some surprising counterintuitive results as you look at some of those things. So I think about that. I also think about, again, human behavior is complex. You have to understand that complexity and bring it to your analysis, and then control for noise. So if you see fewer people of color at the top, you want to make sure you're looking at that on a percentage basis, right? So in most organizations, you see the proportion just does decline as you climb the ladder. What you want to understand is not just the numbers, but those percentages. And you want those percentages compared to what's out there in the talent market. So you really can kind of control for differences in sample sizes. And again, I will take it back to, I always assume positive intent on the behalf of people so that we can scrutinize the processes. And in some cases, I try to take it to an extreme, because from sort of a counseling standpoint, unconditional positive regard means someone can tell you anything and you can act on it without judgment. So in organizations, we have the counterpart of psychological safety. And we know from Google and others that that's something we need to instill. So indirectly, we need to, if we want to be driving the biases out of our processes, we have to empower all of our employees to feel comfortable to speak up when they see those without fear of retribution.
Yeah, thanks, Chris and team. We definitely need to move to the audience Q&A portion of our conversation, but this is rich. The only thing I will add here, though, Chris, is done right. If you ensure that your talent slates are inclusively diverse, you can level the playing field and the probability of the best person always getting the job. Zach, one of our questions in Q&A is around meritocracy. And I want to tie that question directly to the last question I have for you today, which is, how leaders can demonstrate both internal and external that they're using talent analytics to create a fairer workplace. And then how do you establish this when you want to ensure processes, are fair? And that'll dive directly into our question. And let's try to just spend a minute here, because we've got some more we have to get through in the next 8 minutes.
Yeah. So I think one thing that we need to recognize as we approach this idea of meritocracy and how we're looking at performance within an organization is that we cannot eliminate bias. And so we need to build that into a self-reflective cycle of how we look at and talk about performance within the organization. So really simple example of this, let's say you work on something where it's relatively simple to establish metrics in terms of performance. So you run a factory, you've got people who work machines, right? And so you can say, okay, performance is good if you turn out X number of widgets within an hour. And you can say, all right, well, now I can objectively measure performance. It's a total meritocracy, okay? Well, what about how much their manager interrupts them or makes their life more difficult because they don't like their gender or their race or their sexual orientation or whatever it is, right? And so all we've done is establish the appearance of objectivity and meritocracy while building in no protection for the actual bias that's inhibiting the performance. And so I think that recognition and that, all right, well, how would we give feedback to how would we organizationally answer for where bias gets introduced, and just keep holding the mirror up and saying, oh, no, found it over here, and work on it as a process rather than an impossible goal of the complete absence of that bias.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you, Zach, for sharing that with us. And I'm going to throw a little monkey wrench in here. Meritocracy is a myth, but that's a conversation for another day. Another question we have in the chat, and I think we want to get to this one right away because it can have legal implications. It says, how do you set targets? You know, someone has people in their organization who want to review the data and make decisions based on targets, based on their opinions. Who wants to try to answer this within a minute? I have some thoughts, but I'll let you go first.
Just a quick thought here. When we talk about targets, we typically, businesses where they tend to go to is, what should our representation for this look like? What should it look like for that? The guidance that I have consistently provided is those are typically outcomes. What you see there of the processes that we have, our hiring, selection, and our attrition processes, where the guidance should be is eliminating differences in experience, opportunity, and lastly, representation. So whether your turnover is high or low, it should be commensurate between any two subgroups.
Anyone else?
I just want a quick thing on the targets. I think targets you can always set for the enterprise wide, but do they really mean for the managers, right? So that's what an important piece. For example, like if an organization says that I want to achieve 40% people of color representation by X years or something like that, but if a group which is today at 10%, can they achieve 40%, right? So it is always dependent upon enterprise targets, of course, you can set, but when you're looking for an individual decision, it is more about how you are making the progress in terms of the growth each year over year. That is more important rather than just setting a enterprise target and you try to achieve from nowhere currently, but how your processes are kind of evolving over a period of time to improve that growth. That is more important rather than just having a target for the enterprise wide, which you cannot really achieve because you are already at a very poor position in terms of the numbers. So just want to highlight that.
Thank you, team. The one thing I'll add here is partner closely with your legal team on this because we should do a great job with making sure our slates are inclusive on the front end. But when it comes down to actual hiring, it's illegal to hire based on any of these demographic groups. So get in touch with your legal team and make sure that the conversation is being held in the right way so you're not getting your organization in trouble. I do know a lot of people want to make a lot of decisions, but it has to be based on all of the data that's available with the right people in the room. There's another question, and we probably won't be able to answer all of them, but does anyone have any thoughts on what kind of incentives we can suggest for public sector employees? No? Okay, good people. I'm sorry, we don't have a good answer for you on that one, but if we think of something, we'll definitely get it back over to this team. There's another question in here that talks about what is the most efficient and appropriate way to ask employees for feedback without them being afraid of retaliation? Who wants to try to answer this? I think we're 1 minute before we have to wrap up.
Just like I said before, psychological safety, it starts with the culture. There's got to be the ability to speak up and speak your mind freely. That comes first.
Yeah, I would agree with Chris on that. And at the end of the day, when you have people who are challenging you, because I know that's how some people perceive questions, right? Just make it safe for them to continue to challenge you, publicize and celebrate them, because it's one thing for an organization to talk about psychological safety, but it's a whole nother thing for us to actually model it in our behavior so that people feel like they can share with us the things that are most important to them. So team, great conversation today. I have enjoyed sharing all of the wisdom that you all have with everyone who's joining us today. I know we all have the same goal, which is to create a fairer workplace for all of us and for generations to come. So Michael, without further ado, we will turn the platform back over to you.
Thank you, Tony. This is a wonderful panel. Thank you, Christopher, Zach, and Ankit. I also want to thank everyone else for joining us today for this excellent discussion. Now, this session, along with all of today's content, will be available on demand following the event. Thank you, everyone.